before marble temples rose above the Tiber, before legions marched in thunderous rhythm, before emperors and conquests and glory, there was a story, a myth, a beginning. It starts not in Rome, but in flames, the burning ruins of Troy, in the twilight of the Bronze Age. As legend tells, a Trojan prince named Aeneas escaped the city's fall. Guided by the gods, burdened with destiny, he wandered the Mediterranean until fate brought him to the shores of Italy. There, in the misty forests of Latium, Aeneas sowed the seeds of a future that would echo through history. His descendants, so the Romans would claim, would found the greatest city the world had ever known. Centuries passed, kings rose and fell, and then came Numitor, rightful ruler of Alba Longa, a Latin city in the shadow of the Albon hills. Betrayed by his own brother Amulius, Numitor was cast aside, and his daughter Rhea Silvia was forced into sacred vows of chastity. But fate defied man's will. The war god Mars, so the story goes, lay with Rhea Silvia, and from that divine union came twin sons, Romulus and Remus. Amulus, fearing prophecy, ordered the infants drowned, but the Tiber spared them. They were found by a she-wolf, the Lupa, who suckled them beneath a fig tree on the Palatine hill. Later, a shepherd raised them as his own. The twins grew strong, fierce, and wild, destined for something greater than simple lives. When they came of age and learned their true lineage, they restored Numitor to his throne. But their own destiny lay elsewhere. They would found a new city. Yet destiny is not shared equally, and ambition runs in blood. A quarrel arose over who would rule, and where the walls should rise. Remus mocked his brother's designs, leaping over the line Romulus had drawn in the earth. Romulus struck, Remus fell, and so, in fratricide, Rome was born in 753 BCE, according to Roman tradition, founded by the survivor, the killer, the first king, Romulus. The age of kings began, shrouded in myth and shadow. Romulus ruled as warrior and lawgiver. He assembled Rome from outcasts, fugitives, and freed slaves. It was a city of wolves and men, bound not by blood, but by loyalty. In need of women to build a future, the Romans turned to the neighboring Sabines. When negotiations failed, they staged the infamous rape of the Sabine women, not an act of violence as the name suggests, but of abduction and assimilation. The Sabines, enraged, waged war, but their daughters, now Roman wives and mothers, stepped between the armies. Peace was forged, and the two peoples became one. Romulus disappeared in a storm. Some said he was murdered by the Senate, others that he ascended to the heavens as Quirinus, a god of the Roman state. After him came 6 more kings, each adding layers to the young city. Numa Pompilius, a Sabine philosopher king, tamed the warrior spirit of Rome. He introduced religion, temples, priesthood. Under his reign, Rome became more than a camp, it became a civilization. Tullus Hostilius rejected Numa's peace. He was a conqueror. He destroyed Alba Longa, integrating its nobles into Rome and reinforcing the Senate. He was struck by lightning, or so the stories claim, for neglecting the gods. Ancus Marcius, both warrior and builder, founded Ostia, Rome's first port. He brought the Latin towns to heel and built the first bridge over the Tiber, the Pons Sublicius. Then came the Etruscans. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, an Etruscan nobleman, became the 5th king of Rome. Under his rule, the city expanded rapidly. He built the Cloaca Maxima, one of the world's earliest sewage systems, and began the Circus Maximus, a venue for games that could hold tens of thousands. His successor, Severus Tullius, rose from obscurity. Some say he was born a slave. He instituted Rome's first census, dividing the people into classes and centuries based on wealth. This structure would later define the Republic's military and voting systems. Severus also extended Roman territory and began the Servian War, encircling the growing city. But the monarchy would not last forever. The seventh and final king was Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, arrogant and authoritarian. He ruled without the Senate, relying on fear and force. His greatest achievement was the completion of the Temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, on the Capitoline Hill, a towering symbol of Rome's divine favor. Yet his downfall would come not from war or rebellion, but from outrage. In 509 BCE, his son, Sextus Tarquinius, committed a terrible crime. He violated Lucretia, a noblewoman of great virtue. Shamed and dishonored, she took her own life, but not before calling for justice. Her body was displayed in the Forum. The Roman people, outraged, rose in revolt. Led by Lucius Junius Brutus, a relative of the king, they overthrew the monarchy. Tarquin fled into exile, and in his place, the Romans vowed never again to suffer a king. In that year, the Roman Republic was born. Power now lay in the hands of two annually elected consuls who governed side by side. The Senate remained no longer as advisors to a king, but as custodians of the Republic's laws and traditions. The assemblies of Roman citizens gained voice, and though imperfect, a system began to take shape, one of shared rule, balance, and fierce civic pride. The monarchy was over, but the ideas it had forged, discipline, hierarchy, reverence for gods and law, would live on in the Republic. And, one day, in the Empire, Rome was no longer just a city. It was an idea, a force, a promise of order in a chaotic world. From the myths of Troy to the hills of Latium, from wolf-raised children to exiled kings, the story of Rome had begun, and it would not end for 1,000 years. The last king had fallen. Tarquin the Proud, banished and bitter, had fled the city he once ruled. The Romans, humiliated by tyranny and awakened to the dangers of absolute rule, vowed no more kings. In 509 BCE, they crafted a new system, radical and delicate, the Republic. It was not yet a democracy, nor a true oligarchy. It was something uniquely Roman, a system forged in compromise, suspicion, and ambition. The people would be free, but they would also be bound by duty, by law, and by the weight of tradition. Two men would hold supreme power. Consuls, elected annually, each with the authority to veto the other. No one man would ever again rule alone. Behind them stood the Senate, a council of elders, mostly patricians, whose influence often rivaled that of the consuls themselves. And below them, the people, the populus Romanus, divided by class, wealth, and blood, the patricians and plebeians. It was a republic in theory, but in practice, the patricians held most of the cards. They owned the land, controlled the priesthoods, and occupied the highest offices. The plebeians, the farmers, artisans, and soldiers who formed the backbone of Roman society, were left in the shadows of the state. But they would not stay silent for long. Barely had the Republic been born before it was threatened, not by foreign invaders, but by internal conflict. The struggle of the orders, a centuries-long contest between patricians and plebeians, would define the early Republic. It was not a war in the traditional sense, but a relentless push for rights, recognition, and reform. In 494 BCE, when debts crushed the plebeians and courts favored only the wealthy, the common people took dramatic action. They seceded from the city. They marched out and camped on the Sacred Mount, refusing to fight in Rome's wars until they received justice. It was a political strike, and it worked. Rome, always pragmatic, conceded. The plebeians were granted their own officials, the tribunes of the plebs, men who could veto any law they deemed unjust. Their bodies were declared sacrosanct. To strike a tribune was to offend the gods. Over time, more concessions followed. Written laws with the 12 tables in 451 BCE, ensuring transparency. The right to marry patricians. The ability to hold higher offices. Progress was slow, a battle waged over generations, but by the 4th century BCE, plebeians could be consuls, senators, priests. The Roman ideal was not equality, but balance, and the Republic found a way to endure. While internal reform shaped the Republic, external threats tested it. Italy in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE was a patchwork of city-states, tribal confederations, and powerful hill peoples. The Etruscans to the north, once Rome's masters, still held sway over fertile lands. In the central hills lived the fierce Aqui and Volsci, warlike peoples who raided Roman territory. And to the east, in the rugged mountains, dwelled the Samnites, proud and independent, ready to resist Roman control at any cost. War was constant. Rome did not yet seek conquest for conquest's sake, but it sought security, and in Italy that meant expansion. Through decades of struggle, Roman armies, composed of citizen soldiers called to duty, fought season after season. Fields were planted, then abandoned for campaigns. Villages were razed, rebuilt, and razed again. Rome's greatest weapon was not its army, but its system of alliance. Conquered peoples were not destroyed, they were offered a place within the Roman orbit. Some received partial citizenship, others autonomy in exchange for troops. Over time, this Latin League and wider network of allies transformed Rome from a city-state into a regional power, its legions drawn from every corner of Italy. In 390 BCE, disaster struck. From the north came a terrifying force, the Senones, a tribe of Gauls from beyond the Alps. They invaded Etruria, and, upon reaching the banks of the Tiber, met a Roman army at the Battle of the Allia. The Roman lines broke. The city lay undefended. The Gauls sacked Rome. The sacred fire of Vesta was extinguished. The temples burned. The old were slaughtered. The Senate left to die in their togas. Only the Capitoline Hill held out, a last defiant bastion. Rome paid a ransom to 1,000 pounds of gold, and the Gauls withdrew. The humiliation left the scar deeper than any wound. But it did not break the Republic. Rome rebuilt. Stronger walls rose around the city. New reforms restructured the army. The Republic learned. It remembered, and it prepared. Rome's true test came with the Samnite Wars, a brutal, three-part conflict spanning over 50 years, 343 to 290 BC. The Samnites, hardened by the mountains, fought with guerrilla tactics and iron discipline. Rome, accustomed to open-field battles, struggled at first. In 321 BCE, the Romans were trapped in the Caudine Forks, a narrow mountain pass, and forced to surrender without a fight. They were humiliated, made to pass beneath a symbolic yoke of spears. But Rome adapted. It reformed its military, introduced the manipular formation, more flexible than the Greek-style phalanx, and returned to the field. The wars dragged on, devastating central Italy. Villages were destroyed, alliances broken and rebuilt. Eventually, the Samnites were overwhelmed. In 290 BCE, they were forced to submit. With the Samnites defeated, Rome turned to the remaining free peoples of the peninsula, the Etruscans, Umbrians, and Lucanians. One by one, they fell. Rome now held sway over nearly all of mainland Italy, but in the far south, in the coastal cities of Magna Graecia, Rome encountered a very different enemy, one steeped in the traditions of Greek warfare, with elephants, phalanxes, and royal ambitions. When Rome threatened Tarentum, the Greek city-state called upon King Pyrrhus of Epirus, a cousin of Alexander the Great and one of the finest generals of his age. In 280 BCE, Pyrrhus landed in Italy with a professional army and 20 war elephants. At Heraclea and Asculum, he defeated the Romans, but at enormous cost. "One more such victory," he said, "and I am undone." These were the original Pyrrhic victories, wins too costly to matter. Rome refused to yield. It simply raised new armies again and again. Pyrrhus withdrew to Sicily, returned, and was beaten at Beneventum in 275 BCE. He left Italy in defeat. Tarentum surrendered. With Pyrrhus gone, Rome stood alone, unrivaled, undefeated, and undisputed master of Italy. By 264 BCE, Rome's system of conquest was fully formed. Its armies were vast, drawn from loyal allies and colonies spread across the land. Its roads connected cities from the Po to the heel of the boot. Its military service was a duty, not a job. Its victories were shared, spoils distributed, lands colonized, prestige earned. But this growth came at a price. Rome's social structure had changed. The wealth of conquest flowed to the patrician elite. Small farmers returned from war to find their lands sold or abandoned. The latifundia, vast estates worked by slaves, began to rise. The seeds of inequality were sown. The Republic was strong, but it was stretched. And across the sea, a new rival watched with wary eyes. A naval empire, rich from trade and silver. Its ships ruled the western Mediterranean. Its walls were mighty, its people proud. Rome had conquered Italy, but its destiny now lay beyond, across the waves, in wars that would reshape the world. The most savage wars of the ancient world, wars that would redefine power in the Mediterranean, were not born out of sudden hate, but out of fear, ambition, and rivalry. On one side, Rome, the rising juggernaut of Italy, her legions hardened by a century of war, her people stubborn, relentless, and hungry for glory. On the other, Carthage, mistress of the seas, a Phoenician city of merchants and mariners, rich beyond reckoning, whose influence stretched from North Africa to Spain, Sicily, and beyond. For over 300 years, Carthage had ruled the western Mediterranean, her power rooted in commerce, her armies built on gold. Rome, by contrast, had no empire, not yet. But that would change, because in 264 BCE, a spark ignited the greatest conflict the ancient world had ever known. The Punic Wars. Sicily, a jewel of the Mediterranean, fertile and strategic, was the flashpoint. For centuries, it had been the prize of empires. Now, Rome and Carthage both laid claim to it. The war began in Messina, where a band of mercenaries, called the Mamertines, asked Rome for help against Carthage. Rome agreed, perhaps rashly, and landed troops in Sicily. Carthage saw it as an act of war, and war it became. For Rome, it was a new kind of battle. Their legions were unmatched on land, but Carthage ruled the sea. So Rome built a fleet from scratch, copying a captured Carthaginian ship bolt for bolt. But they didn't just copy, they innovated. They added the corvus, a boarding bridge that turned sea battles into infantry clashes. The Roman soldier, not the sailor, would win the war. What followed was a brutal 23-year struggle. Battles raged across Sicily. Naval clashes turned the seas red. Rome won at Mylae 260 BCE, then lost at Drepana. Storms wrecked fleets, but the Senate always rebuilt. Always. By 241 BCE, Rome had worn Carthage down. With their navy shattered and their treasury empty, Carthage sued for peace. They surrendered Sicily, paid a massive indemnity, and pulled out of the island entirely. Rome had won its first overseas province, but victory came at a cost. Hundreds of thousands dead, and a new appetite awakened. The Republic, once confined to Italy, now eyed the wider world. Peace is a fragile thing. In the aftermath of the First Punic War, Carthage was in turmoil. Its mercenaries, unpaid and angry, rebelled in a savage conflict known as the Truthless War. Carthage barely survived. Rome, seeing weakness, took Sardinia and Corsica, islands promised to remain Carthaginian. It was an opportunistic move, and Carthage never forgot it. But from this chaos emerged a new power, a family of generals with ambition equal to Rome's. Their name was Barca. Their mission, rebuild Carthaginian power, not in Africa, but in Spain. Hamilcar Barca, father of the famous Hannibal, led the conquest of Iberia. City by city, tribe by tribe, he forged a new empire, rich in silver, full of warriors. When he died, his son-in-law Hasdrubal continued his work. And when Hasdrubal was assassinated in 221 BCE, command fell to a 26-year-old boy trained from childhood to hate Rome. His name would become legend, Hannibal. It was the most dangerous war Rome had ever faced, and the most iconic. Hannibal, charismatic, brilliant, and ruthless, sought not merely to fight Rome, but to break her, to shatter her alliances, to destroy her from within. The pretext came quickly. A Roman city in Spain, Saguntum, was attacked by Hannibal's forces in 219 BCE. Rome protested. Hannibal ignored them. War was declared. Then, in a feat unmatched even today, Hannibal did the impossible. He led over 90,000 men, 37 war elephants, and thousands of cavalry from Spain, through Gaul, across the Alps, in winter. He lost half his army to snow, starvation, and skirmishes, but what emerged on the other side was a force unlike any Rome had faced. The invasion of Italy had begun. In 218 BCE, at the Battle of the Trebia, Hannibal used cunning and cold to lure the Romans into a freezing river and crushed them. In 217 BCE, at Lake Trasimene, he sprang an ambush from the fog and annihilated another army, the largest ambush in ancient history. Panic spread in Rome. Cities began to falter. Fear grew. Hannibal was in Italy, undefeated. In 216 BCE, Rome raised a colossal army, over 80,000 men, to end it. They met Hannibal at Cannae in one of the most studied battles in history. Hannibal's outnumbered army formed a crescent, lured the Romans in, and then encircled them completely. The slaughter was apocalyptic. Over 50,000 Romans died in a single day. Entire legions vanished. It was Rome's darkest hour. Allies defected. Cities like Capua and Tarentum opened their gates to Hannibal. The Senate debated abandoning Italy, but it did not collapse. Rome responded not with surrender, but with patience. They adopted a new strategy, Fabian tactics, named for the general Quintus Fabius Maximus. Avoid battle, harass supply lines, never give Hannibal the chance to strike a fatal blow. Meanwhile, Rome expanded the war. In Spain, young generals, first Publius Cornelius Scipio, then his son, began dismantling Carthage's base of power. In Africa, Rome forged new alliances with Numidian kings. Hannibal, now stranded in Italy without reinforcements, could not strike Rome itself. His greatest victories could not win the war. By 204 BCE, the tide had turned. A rising Roman general, Scipio Africanus, invaded Africa. Carthage recalled Hannibal to defend the homeland. In 202 BCE, the two greatest commanders of the age met at Zamor. Scipio, using tactics adapted from Hannibal himself, broke the Carthaginian lines. Numidian cavalry, once Hannibal's strength, now fought for Rome. Hannibal was defeated. Carthage surrendered. It lost its fleet, its empire, and its independence in foreign policy. It survived, but barely. Rome emerged, not just victorious, but transformed. No longer a city fighting for survival, but a superpower with influence stretching from Spain to Greece, from the Alps to the Sahara. For 50 years, Carthage lived in the shadow of Rome. It rebuilt its economy. It prospered, but it was not trusted. In the Senate, voices rose, none louder than Cato the Elder, who ended every speech, regardless of topic, with the words Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. Eventually, Rome found its excuse. Carthage defended itself from a neighboring African kingdom in violation of Rome's imposed treaties. That was enough. In 149 BCE, Rome declared war once more. This time, it would not be content with victory. It wanted annihilation. For 3 years, Carthage resisted. House by house, street by street. It was a desperate, heroic defense. But in 146 BCE, Rome breached the walls. The city burned. Thousands were slaughtered. Survivors were sold into slavery. Legend says the fields were sown with salt, a symbol of utter destruction. Carthage was no more. Rome now stood unchallenged in the western Mediterranean. Its navy ruled the seas. Its armies were unbeaten. Its territories vast, from Spain to North Africa to Sicily and beyond. But with empire came new problems. Wealth flowed into the hands of the few. Slavery increased. The values of the old republic began to erode. Ambition, once curbed by tradition, now burned hotter than ever before. The Punic Wars had forged Rome's greatness, but they had also planted the seeds of its internal decay. Rome emerged from the Punic Wars victorious, dominant over the western Mediterranean, yet beneath the triumph, the foundation trembled. Victory's spoils enriched a few, estranged many, and cracked the values that had forged the Republic. As Rome expanded, so did the gap between the patrician elites and the plebeian backbone. The smallholders turned poor, the veterans landless, the ambitious nobility hungry for honor. Gaius Marius, a Roman consul and military reformer, emerged at this volatile juncture. Around 107 BCE, while North Africa reeled from invasion and northern tribes threatened Italy's borders, Marius opened the legions to landless citizens with no property, no stake in the ancestral traditional order, but fierce in patriotism and loyalty. With this reform, legions became professional armies, not temporary citizen soldiers, but career soldiers. Their oaths lay not to Rome, but to the general who paid them. This shift ignited political and social tremors. Marius won wars 6 times, elected consul, and savored triumphs over the Cimbric and Teutonic tribes. Yet, each victory inflated his ambition. The Senate recoiled at his populist maneuvers. When disaster struck in Numidia, Marius subordinate Lucius Cornelius Sulla, an aristocratic patrician, returned triumphant, claiming credit. A feud began that would tear the Republic apart. Sulla, embittered by Senate manipulation, marched his legions into Rome itself in 88 BC, the first time a Roman army had done so. He seized the city, declared himself dictator, and rewrote the Republic's institutions. Senate authority was restored. Populist tribunes were silenced, but Sulla's vengeance was ruthless. His proscriptions lists of enemies branded for execution destroyed hundreds of political opponents. Their property was confiscated, their names erased. It was a dark chapter of dictatorship born in blood and terror. Yet even Sulla could not restore stability. Upon relinquishing power in 79 BCE, he left behind an arc of destruction. And while he lived privately in luxury, Rome's wounds festered. A new generation of leaders, brilliant, ambitious, and uncompromising, would rise to fill the void. In 73 BCE, as Rome grappled with power struggles, a revolt erupted not by generals, but by slaves. Spartacus, a Thracian former gladiator, escaped a training school with 70 comrades. His force swelled into tens of thousands. They defeated Roman legions, liberated slave villages, and marched through Italy as a symbol of desperate hope. For a time, Rome trembled. Yet, internal divisions and lack of planning crippled the rebellion. Marcus Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, cornered the rebels and crushed them at the Battle of the Silurius in 71 BC, spending vast sums to raise loyal men when Senate contracts stalled. Thousands of captured slaves were crucified along the Appian Way, a grim warning to others. Spartacus' revolt exposed the Republic's moral and social rot. Inequality, dispossession, and a state reliant on slave toil. Rome had won, but at great cost to its values. In the aftermath, 3 men rose above the chaos: Marcus Licinius Crassus, Gnaeus Pompeius, Magnus Pompey, and Gaius Julius Caesar. They formed an unholy alliance in 60 BC, a political pact known as the First Triumvirate. Crassus, richest of all, provided vast resources. Pompey, Rome's greatest general, commanded armies. Caesar, ambitious and charismatic, sought power through populist legislation and conquest. Together, they bypassed the Senate, passing land reforms for veterans, extending citizenship to Gaul, and reshaping Roman politics. But this coalition, built on ambition and mutual use, could not last. Crassus died in 53 BCE in Parthia, seeking glory and wealth in Persia. His defeat at Carrhae shattered the alliance. Pompey, once Caesar's friend, moved closer to the Senate, seeking legitimacy. Caesar, elected consul in 59 BCE, had by then launched his Gallic Wars, conquering all of Gaul and becoming immensely popular with his troops and the people. In 49 BCE, the Senate, fearing Caesar's power, ordered him to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen, an invitation to disgrace or exile. Caesar stood at the Rubicon River on the border of Italy. One small step, one monumental decision, alia iacta est, the die is cast. He crossed. Civil war broke out. The western provinces, Spain, Gaul, Africa, rallied to Caesar. Pompey and the Senate armied the Italian legions. Battles raged. Brutus in Spain, Curio in Africa, but Pompey held Italy. Caesar seized Rome, then pursued Pompey across the Adriatic at Pharsalus in 48 BCE. Caesar's smaller force triumphed by discipline and strategy. Pompey fled and was murdered in Egypt. With Pompey gone, Caesar pursued power across the East. He was proclaimed dictator, but not without enemies. His popularity among soldiers and the plebs terrified the Senate. As dictator, Caesar reshaped Rome. He introduced Julian calendar, reformed the Senate by adding supporters, granted citizenship across provinces, restructured debt laws, and began ambitious building projects. He was benefactor, reformer, godlike, figure unto himself. Yet his reforms unsettled the old aristocracy. On the 15th of March 44 BCE, in the Ides of March, Caesar was stabbed 23 times at the theatre of Pompey by a group of senators. Among them were Brutus and Cassius. Supporters turned conspirators. Caesar bled in their betrayal. His last words, according to legend, Et Brute, echoed the ultimate personal tragedy amid political collapse. Caesar's death did not restore the Republic. His murder plunged Rome into renewed chaos. The second triumvirate, Mark Antony, Octavian, the future Augustus, and Lepidus, rose to crush Caesar's assassins. Proscriptions followed, proscriptions again, alliances shifted. By 31 BCE, Octavian triumphed at Actium, defeating Antony and Cleopatra. He became sole ruler. In 27 BCE, he was granted the title Augustus, marking the end of the Roman Republic and the birth of the Roman Empire. The ideals of shared power, civic pride, and balanced government were buried with Brutus and Cassius. Caesar's story was the death knell of the Republic itself. From Republic to Empire, Rome, transformed, never looked back. In the silent twilight after the storm, Rome stood upon the edge of despair. A century of civil wars had devastated her leadership, shattered her republic, and prophesied her end. From the fields of Actium to the halls of power in Rome, the city had endured, survived, but now required something more than victory. It needed transformation. Octavian, the adopted heir of Julius Caesar, returned to Rome not as a conqueror, but as a reformer. In 27 BCE, he accepted the title Augustus, becoming the first princeps, the first among equals, of a new era, the Roman Empire. Yet, in appearances, he restored the Senate, honored republican traditions, and claimed to serve the people. In reality, he held supreme power, an emperor cloaked in restraint. Augustus redefined Rome. He filled the Senate with new blood, veterans and loyalists from the provinces. He created standing armies, loyal only to the emperor, not assembled annually, but stationed across borders. The grain dole was reorganized. Veterans were settled in colonies. Monuments and temples were built with civic pride. He enacted moral legislation, encouraged marriage, rebuilt Rome from brick to marble, and claimed the title Father of the Country. Under his rule, a transformative peace emerged, the Pax Romana. For nearly 2 centuries, 27 BC, 180 CE, Rome would know no great civil war. Instead, prosperity flowed. Roads crisscrossed the empire, 19,000 miles of Valle. Trade routes wove Europe, North Africa, and Asia Minor. Roman law became the language of justice. Latin became not merely the language of court and church, but the backbone of new cultures. Augustus died in 14 CE, age 76, still revered, but his successors struggled to match his wisdom or restraint. The Julio-Claudian line included heirs who inherited not only power, but dynastic pressure, Tiberius, capable but brooding, Caligula, charismatic then cruel, Claudius, scholarly and efficient but vulnerable, Nero, decadent and doomed. Their reigns oscillated between competence and chaos, yet Rome endured. Under Claudian rule, the empire expanded. Claudius conquered Britannia, gains, yet centralized power in Rome's heart. Nero oversaw artistic ambition, then staged the Great Golden House after Rome burned in 64 CE, fire some claimed he orchestrated. Revolts followed. Nero died by his own hand in 68 CE. The immediate civil war of the Year of Four Emperors followed. But ultimately Rome stabilized, with Vespasian's rise, founding the Flavian dynasty. Vespasian, a general of humble origins, returned peace to the empire. He began construction of the Colosseum, symbol of lasting stability, under his sons Titus and Domitian. The Flavian era saw the completion of Pompey's excavation, recovery from eruptions, and the entrenchment of imperial bureaucracy. Acceptance of Roman citizenship was broader. Provincial elites were now senators. The seeds of Romanization took root across the empire. In the 2nd century CE emerged the Antonine emperors, remembered as the 5 good emperors Nerva, Trajan, Adrian, Antoninus, Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. Each adopted capable heirs, ensuring stable transition. The empire reached its apex under Trajan r. 98 to 117 CE, whose campaigns drove into Dacia, modern Romania, yielding gold mines and territorial expansion. Hadrian consolidated the borders, fortifying walls in Britain and reinforcing garrison lines across the empire to preserve unity rather than chase conquest. Under Hadrian, the empire's peoples were unified by identity, not force. Monuments, like the Pantheon, rebuilt by Hadrian, reflect an idea of Rome reaching toward the heavens. Roman law, inscribed across provinces, enriched daily life. Trade flourished on sea and land, and sovereignty embodied humility. Trajan's column celebrated civic victory. Marcus Aurelius, philosopher-king, wrote meditations while leading Rome in war. The empire's golden age ended with Marcus and Lucius Verus, his co-emperor. When plague swept through the legions around 165 CE, borders started fraying. Commodus, heir to Marcus Aurelius, whose reign foreshadowed decline, ascended in 180 CE. Though Gentile memory romanticizes this era, cracks were spreading beneath marble facades. Beyond emperors, prosperity lay in Rome's institutions, civic life, forums, basilicas, amphitheaters, baths, all carved in stone across the empire. Romans had access to public amenities and the law precedented in history. Infrastructure, roads, aqueducts, sewage systems like the Aqua Claudia and Cloaca Maxima, and harbors in Ostia and Alexandria. Legal unity, the development of just gentium, law of nations, granting rights to citizens and non-citizens alike. Currency and taxation, standardization of coinage, the denarius, and systemic taxation allowed trade and military funding across continents. These networks of law, roads, grain, and court formed a single system from Britain to Bosporus. Roman identity became global, yet peace held peril. The relentless tax burden, reliance on slave labor, and urbanization created inequality. The senatorial aristocracy grew wealthy. Small farmers lost their lands to latifundia. The gap between rich and poor divided households and politics alike. Philosophical critiques, Stoicism, Epicureanism, cynicism, merged seeking meaning beyond wealth. Foreign cohorts, Syrians, Spaniards, Gauls fought in Rome's legions and wore the emperor's purple. Rome, once purely Latin, became multicultural, an immense melting pot of languages, religions, gods, and customs. The peace was golden but restless beneath. During the Pax Romana, Rome's light shone across 3 continents. The empire's people spoke Latin, worshipped Jupiter and Isis, traded olive oil from Hispania, grain from Egypt, and silk from the Far East. Roman legions marched not for survival, but for order. Patricians built villas in Tiber's hills. Freedmen married senators. Artisans carved synagogues and churches into the rock of Petra. But even empires, born in peace, carry within them the seeds of decline. Commodus would kill his brother, pacify rebellion, and ensure that power stayed in his twisted, capricious hands. By the time of the late 2nd century, the emperor's image had degraded from revered prince to despotic godman. Empire was golden, glory reigned, but transformation imperial immense, innovative also brought cultural divisions, dependence on force, and shifts in civic identity. Rome had become more than a city. It was a global system, but systems decay, institutions ossify, moral authority fades. The empire might outwardly glow, but inside, the foundation quaked. Rome had reached the pinnacle of power. Its empire stretched from the misty highlands of Caledonia to the shifting sands of Mesopotamia. Under the Antonines, peace reigned. Under Marcus Aurelius, rule was tempered by wisdom and stoicism. Yet, even golden ages end not with triumph, but in a death spiral. In 180 CE, at the age of 53, Marcus Aurelius breathed his last at Vindobona. His son, Commodus, ascended. But the world of philosophy gave way to tyranny. Commodus wore the purple, not as a servant, but as a demigod. In the Colosseum, he faced beasts real and imaginary dressed as Hercules, reveling in blood and drama. His rule grew decadent. Senators were murdered on whim. Rome trembled beneath a ruler more actor than emperor. On December 31st, 192 CE, Commodus was strangled in his bath, executed not by foreign foe, but by his own palace conspirators. The Republic's legacy faltered at a poisoned chalice. With death came confusion. Lines of succession fractured. In the chaos, the Senate sold the empire to the highest bidder. Pertinax, a centurion turned senator, purchased the throne for 25,000 sesterces, but the Praetorian Guard, ever mercenary, killed him after 8 chaotic weeks. They then auctioned the throne again just as Rome grew dizzy with madness. In the horror of 193 CE, 5 men claimed power in rapid succession: Pertinax, Didius, Julianus, the guard-chosen emperor, then the generals, Pescennius, Niger, Clodius Albinus, and Septimius. Severus, as far-flung legions, swore oaths to each contender. Rome fractured. Civil war threatens. The capital's streets whisper of generals marching in with armies, of senators crawling for favor. Rome was at the mercy of ambition. Ultimately, Septimius Severus prevailed. A soldier of African origin, he marched into Rome with discipline. He executed his rivals. He paid off the Praetorian Guard. He rooted power in the army, not the Senate. He declared, peace has been restored. But his autocratic order set a precedent for emperors to come. With him, the Severan dynasty began. A new era of instability took form. Severus reformed the army. He doubled the Praetorian Guard's pay. He opened high office to equestrian soldier bureaucrats loyal to the throne. As he died in 211 CE at York, his sons took power, Caracalla and Geta, but that unity lasted little. Caracalla, ruthless, had Geta murdered in his mother's arms. That murder sealed a bloody era. Caracalla's reign was paradoxical. He murdered senators for sport, but also conferred Roman citizenship to every free man in the empire, the Constitutio Antoniniana, 212 CE. He raised taxes to fund colossal public baths and tribute to his divine rule. His name became infamous, until his own palace guard killed him near Carrhae in 217 CE with his death. The empire lurched again. Macrinus, an equestrian officer, seized power but lacked legitimacy. He made peace with Parthia, which enraged the military. In 218 CE, two powerful women, Julia Misa, sister of the deified Julia Domna, and her daughter Julia Soemias, grandmother of Elagabalus Engineer, a coup. Their grandson, a teenager born and raised in Emis's cult of the Syrian sun god, was proclaimed emperor. Elagabalus, 218 to 222 CE, reigned in scandal and religious upheaval. He replaced Jupiter with Elagabala, the sun god, wearing the sacred black stone of Emesa and demanding worship. He married a Vestal virgin, rebelling against centuries of Roman tradition. His decadence outraged the legions and senators alike. In 222 CE, his grandmother engineered his assassination and brought his cousin, Alexander Severus, to power. Young, intelligent, and humane, Alexander Severus sought reform. He restored courts, reduced taxes, and consulted jurists on justice. He tolerated multiple faiths. Rome breathed hope once more, but the army remained to be appeased. In 232–233 CE, he campaigned in the east and the Parthian frontier while Germanic tribes and Alemanni raided across the Rhine. His general, Maximinus Thrax, campaigned bravely, but the emperor's soldiers preferred a soldier king. Into CE, Alexander and his mother were murdered in Mainz. Maximinus was proclaimed emperor by the legions as the Severan thread ended with their deaths. Rome slipped into endless rotation where emperors were no longer selected by law or birth, but by troops' oath, and the empire frayed. By the mid-3rd century, the empire was weakened from within as well as without. Military overreach, borders stretched from the Euphrates to the Danube, legions were deployed constantly, loyalty tied to generals rather than Rome. Economic breakdown, inflation soared, debasement of the denarius collapsed trade, taxation increased ruthlessly, political rapid turnover. From 235 to 284 CE, over 50 emperors reignmost died violently. Foreign pressures, Germanic tribes overran Gaul. Persians recaptured Mesopotamia and sacked Antioch. Plague, the Antonine Plague, and later the Plague of Cyprian, decimated populations, merchants, farmers. In this crucible, Rome teetered. But Part 1 ends here with the curtain falling on the Severan era, and the empire consumed by civil war and crisis. Rome was no longer an empire of order, it was an empire unraveling. Rome was tearing itself apart. Between 235 and 284 CE, the empire collapsed into chaos. Generals seized the throne, emperors perished in battle or betrayal, borders bled under relentless invasion, and plagues ravaged soldiers and civilians alike. Yet, in the darkness, a rebirth was forged in crisis. Rome would reinvent itself. The 3rd century crisis reshaped the empire. The murder of Alexander Severus in 235 triggered decades of turmoil. Provinces seceded under usurpers like Postumus in Gaul and Zenobia in Palmyra. Armies loyal to individual commanders became political machines. A legion stationed in the Balkans might crown an emperor, while another on the Rhine deposed him. Civil war reigned. In the east, Queen Zenobia young, powerful, cultured established the Palmyrene Empire centered in Palmyra. From Syria to Egypt, her armies expelled Roman governors and minted gold coins bearing her likeness. In the west, Postumus declared the Gallic Empire, controlling Gaul, Britain, and Hispania. Rome's unity was shattered. Septimius Severus's dynasty had failed. Gallienus and his predecessors could not stop division. Borders collapsed under invasion. Goths crossed the Danube, Alans and Persians attacked in the east, while Saxons raided the North Sea coasts. The once sturdy frontiers were under siege. In 284 CE, Diocletian ascended as emperor, man of cavalry origins, not aristocrat. He recognized the problem. One man could not govern the vast and turbulent empire alone. In 293 CE, he instituted the Tetrarchy, splitting power among 4 rulers, 2 Augusti and 2 Caesars, ruling east and west. Diocletian reorganized the empire. He increased the army, stationed them along troubled borders. He reformed taxation, requiring citizens to stay in their registered professions, creating a rigid hierarchy filled with bureaucratic detail. He divided the empire into smaller administrative units, dioceses, provinces, prefectures, across east and west. By the edict on maximum prices, he attempted to stabilize inflation, though it failed audibly. The empire was too fractured for single solutions. Yet, Rome had survived by decentralizing. In 303 CE, Diocletian initiated the empire's last and most brutal persecution of Christians. Churches burned, scriptures outlawed, bishops executed. For a time, Christian identity became a threat to citizenship. Yet, the faithful endured. Persecution could suppress religious symbols, but it could not crush devotion. It forged a community bound by martyrdom, not proximity. In 305 CE, Diocletian abdicated, entering retired life. The Tetrarchy cracked. Conflict erupted again. In the West, rival power struggles removed emperors and reshuffled alliances. Amid this chaos, Constantine, Caesar, under Diocletian's successor, emerged. In 312 CE, on the eve of the Battle of Milvian Bridge, legend says he saw a cross in the sky inscribed within hoc signo vinces. In this sign you will conquer. He ordered his soldiers to paint the sign of Christ on their shields. Constantine triumphed. On the battlefield, pagan temples, the city's power brokers, and the old aristocracy began to yield to a new ideology. Constantine's rule marked a turning point. In 313 CE, he issued the Edict of Milan, granting religious tolerance to Christians and allowing property restitution. He promoted bishops to political offices and gifted land to church foundations. He commissioned a new capital, Constantinople, a fortress city on the Bosporus, built on Byzantium's ruins, declaring it Rome's Christian successor. By the time Constantine died in 337 CE, Christianity was no longer a sect, it had become the empire's religion. He was baptized on his deathbed, sealing the transformation. Over a century of collapse forged Rome into something new. The empire moved from autocracy to a divided monarchy, and back, but with centralized institutions intact. Religious authority shifted from pagan priesthoods to bishops and Christian councils. Provincial elites integrated into the church, region by region. The economy decentralized by necessity. struggled to maintain unity, but centuries later, law, architecture, and faith reconnected the empire's fragments. Constantine's victory at Milvian Bridge, the Edict of Milan, and the founding of Constantinople are more than turning points. They symbolize Rome's survival through adaptability. Ancient Rome had fallen and risen again as an empire infused with Christianity. Crisis had purged the Republic's ancient order. What remained was an empire that clung not to senatorial oligarchy, but to doctrinal unity, to disciplined administration, to a God who promised immortality to souls, not borders. The Tetrarchy would collapse after Diocletian's abdication. Civil war would return. But Rome's new foundations with Christianity and Constantinople would resonate for centuries. Though the West would fall in 476 CE, the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, would endure for another 1,000 years. Rome had survived plague, invasion, usurpation, and upheaval. From crisis came reinvention. From chaos emerged continuity. What once seemed unbreakable was broken. What seemed broken would outlast empires. The empire was not dead. It had only become different. The Roman Empire once spanned from the wind-swept moors of Britain to the golden deserts of Egypt, from the silver-flecked coasts of Hispania to the bustling silk roads of Syria. Its legions carved roads across 3 continents. Its law spoke in the tongue of emperors and gods. For centuries, the Roman world endured storms of invasion, insurrection, and succession. But in the year 395 AD, an irreversible split would set the stage for its end. The death of Emperor Theodosius, the first in 395, marked more than a passing. It signaled a fracture. Theodosius was the last man to rule both East and West as a unified whole. A devout Christian and ruthless statesman, he crushed pagan temples and reasserted orthodoxy, but even he could not knit the empire into permanence. Upon his death, the 2 halves of the empire were passed to his 2 sons, Arcadius in the east, ruling from Constantinople, and Honorius in the west, ruling from the less defensible Milan and eventually Ravenna. Though emperors still bore the Roman name, they were now little more than ceremonial figures, children controlled by court bureaucrats, generals, and eunuchs. Real power rested with strongmen like Stilicho, a half-Vandal Roman general who served as regent for the child emperor. Honorius Stilicho understood the darkness on the horizon. Along the Danube and Rhine, restless peoples watched with hungry eyes. These were not the same ragtag bands of wandering tribes that Rome had subdued in centuries past. These were organized confederations, Goths, Vandals, Alans, and Suebi, many of whom had served in Rome's own armies as foederati. The Rhine frontier, once held by chainmail and stone, had become a sieve. Among these rising leaders was Alaric, a Visigoth general once in service to Theodosius himself. After being denied promised rewards and commands, Alaric turned against Rome. In 401, he invaded Italy. Stilicho held him off, barely, at the Battle of Pollentia. But the Goths were not defeated. They were hungry, determined, and had nothing left to lose. Rome's coffers were strained. Its generals were divided. Its court was suspicious. Factions in the imperial bureaucracy accused Stilicho of treason and had him executed in 408. This act removed the empire's last competent Western general. In response, tens of thousands of barbarian mercenaries in Roman service defected, joining Alaric's ranks. In 410 AD, with no general capable of opposing him and the Senate paralyzed, Alaric descended on Rome itself. The gates were opened. What followed was not the total destruction of the city, but something arguably worse, a symbolic death blow. For the first time in 800 years, Rome had been sacked, temples were looted, senators were humiliated, sacred relics stolen. The Christian world recoiled. How could the new god of Rome allow the city of saints to fall? Pagan voices blamed Christianity for weakening Rome's martial spirit. Christian thinkers, such as Saint Augustine, responded with theology. His city of God declared that the fall of an earthly city was irrelevant to the kingdom of heaven. But the truth was more material. Rome had lost the power to defend itself. The sack did not destroy the empire, but it shocked it. Refugees fled to Africa, Gaul, and the eastern cities. The symbolic center of the empire was no longer the eternal city. It was Ravenna, a backwater fortified marsh on the Adriatic. Rome no longer controlled its own destiny. As Alaric moved on, Rome began to fade into irrelevance. The Senate, once the soul of republican governance, had become a relic. Real authority had fled to Ravenna, where the Emperor Honorius presided in fear behind high walls. Ravenna became the Western imperial capital not because of its majesty, but because of its defensibility. Surrounded by swamps and accessible only by causeway, it was less vulnerable to siege, but its isolation reflected the isolation of the court. While the East prospered in Constantinople with golden domes, silk trade, and professional armies, West's emperors became hostages of their own generals. The empire's armies no longer fought out of loyalty. They fought for money. And as the tax base shrank, so too did military discipline. In many cases, the empire simply invited barbarians in as settlers and soldiers, promising them land in exchange for defense. This practice, once pragmatic, would prove catastrophic. While Italy burned, the provinces broke away. In Britannia, Roman legions had long been underfunded and overextended. By 410 AD, the emperor had withdrawn the last garrisons. The Romano-British were told to look to their own defense. Soon, Saxons and Angles began their migrations, planting the seeds of what would become England. In Gaul, regional commanders began carving out their own realms. One such man, Constantine III, declared himself emperor and moved into Hispania. Rome could no longer prevent pretenders from claiming the purple. It simply lacked the force. Meanwhile, the Rhine frontier shattered completely in 406, when a massive coalition of Vandals, Suebi, and Alans crossed the frozen river and poured into Gaul. There, they pillaged, raped, and burned Roman towns before moving into Hispania. Rome, exhausted, gave them land in a desperate attempt to pacify them. But peace would not come. In North Africa, Rome's breadbasketer, general named Boniface, found himself under pressure from imperial politics. Cut off from Ravenna and fearing assassination, he invited the Vandals, now in southern Hispania, to cross into Africa to support him. They never left. By 439 AD, the Vandals under Genseric captured Carthage, Rome's second city in Africa. It was a death blow to the Western economy. Rome's grain ships no longer came. Famine and inflation set in. The city that once fed millions now withered. Genseric's Vandals did not stop. They built a fleet and began raiding the Mediterranean, even threatening Sicily and Italy. The Roman navy, once dominant, had become a memory. By 439 AD, the Western Empire had lost Africa, Britain, parts of Gaul, and its oldest city to enemies once thought beneath contempt. What remained was a hollow shell, a name without power, a capital without armies, a throne surrounded by ghosts. Yet the final fall had not come. Not yet. The empire had once built roads that stretched across the known world. It had ruled the waves, dictated law, and crushed kings beneath its standard. But by 439 AD, the map of the Western Roman Empire resembled a battlefield of retreat. Its legions were shadows, its emperors were children, its enemies wore Roman armor and spoke Latin prayers. The fall had begun, not with a cataclysm, but with a slow unraveling. After the fall of Carthage in 439, Genseric's Vandals transformed from land warriors into pirates of empire. With Carthage as their naval base, they launched raids across the Mediterranean, plundering Sicily, sacking Corsica, and even threatening Italy itself. Rome had no fleet to stop them. The once proud navy that crushed Carthage in the Punic Wars now existed only in memory. The Vandals, ironically, became masters of the sea. The grain shipments that fed Rome vanished. The Eternal City, already weakened by population decline and political instability, now faced famine. Bread riots erupted. Senators funded public grain distributions out of private wealth, but even the richest could not outpace hunger. The empire turned to diplomacy. The Empress Licinia Eudoxia, widow of Emperor Valentinian III, would eventually negotiate with Genseric, but in 455 AD, the Vandals sailed up the Tiber and entered Rome itself, this time not as Visigoths had before, but with coordinated plunder. Churches were stripped of gold and relics. Noble women were carried off as hostages. The sacking lasted 2 weeks. Rome, again, was humiliated. In the vacuum of authority, real power belonged to Magister Militaris of soldiers. Emperors came and went, often installed by generals or barbarian kingmakers. Among the most powerful was Ricimer, a Germanic commander who played the empire like a chessboard. From 456 to 472, he appointed no fewer than 3 puppet emperors, none of whom dared challenge his authority. Rome no longer produced men of destiny. The Senate, a hollow institution, existed for ceremonial acclaim. The imperial palace in Ravenna sat beneath the weight of silence. Letters from the Eastern Emperor, who still ruled from mighty Constantinople, acknowledged these puppet rulers, but offered little else. The East would not save the West. It couldn't. Ricimer died in 472, but the pattern continued. One general replaced another. One emperor succeeded another. Glycerius, Julius, Nepos, and others flashed into history like fading stars. In 475, a Roman general named Orestes rose to prominence. Once a secretary to Attila the Hun, Orestes had returned to Italy and now wielded the same manipulative power as Ricimer. He deposed the sitting emperor and installed his own son-boy named Romulus, barely a teenager. The name was thick with irony. Romulus Augustulus, little Augustus, and also Romulus, the mythical founder of Rome. A boy emperor with the name of a god-king on a throne with no army, no wealth, and no allies. By this time, Italy was no longer Roman in any meaningful way. Its military was composed of Germanic foederati, most of them loyal not to the emperor, but to their own leaders. When these troops demanded land in Italy for their services and were refused, they rose up. In 476, the Germanic leader, Odoacer, commander of foederati, marched on Ravenna. He offered a bargain. Romulus would be spared if he abdicated. There was no army to resist, no political will to oppose. Romulus, Augustulus, last emperor of the West, was deposed without a battle. He was sent into retirement with a pension in Campania. Odoacer did not declare himself emperor. Instead, he sent the imperial insignia, the diadem, and purple robes, to the Eastern Emperor Zeno in Constantinople. He declared that one emperor was enough and that he, Odoacer, would govern Italy in Zenos' name. This simple gesture marked the official end of the Western Roman Empire. No trumpet sounded, no barbarian banner flew over the Palatine. The end came in quiet decrees and political convenience. The Roman Empire in the West, born from blood, ruled by emperors, forged in steel, had become a memory. 1,000 years of glory extinguished in the turning of a page. But the story of Rome would not end here. Not yet. Rome had not fallen, not truly, while the West withered beneath the weight of chaos. A different Rome was rising in the Eastern Empire, redefined by strategy, bureaucracy, and faith. This was not the Rome of togas and republican ideals. This was a Rome of emperors divine, of cities fortified by wealth and vision. A Rome that would last another 1,000 years. To understand this transformation, we must go back not to the final collapse, but to the moment a man named Diocletian seized control. In 284 AD, after decades of chaos, civil war, and economic collapse, a former soldier from Dalmatia rose to power, Diocletian. He would prove to be one of the most radical reformers in Roman history. The crisis of the 3rd century had nearly shattered the empire. More than 20 emperors had ruled in less than 50 years, many meeting violent ends. Borders had collapsed, plagues had decimated populations, currency had become worthless, armies served whoever paid them most. Diocletian's solution was bold. Divide the empire into manageable pieces. He established the tetrarchy, or rule of 4, to senior emperors, called Augusti, and to junior emperors, called Caesars. Each would govern a quadrant of the empire. The logic was military and administrative. No single man could control such a vast territory alone. He also overhauled the military, separating civil and military command to prevent ambitious generals from marching on Rome. He imposed strict price controls, reorganized provincial taxation, and forced hereditary service in many trades to stabilize labor. But Diocletian's reforms came at a cost: freedom for order, tradition for discipline. The empire was no longer the flexible state of the republic, it was now a top-down autocracy. Diocletian demanded to be addressed as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. The emperor was no longer first among equals. There was one problem Diocletian could not solve: Christianity. The early Christian movement had grown steadily for centuries, quietly, often underground, especially in urban centers. Christians refused to worship the emperor. They rejected the gods of the old world. Diocletian saw this not just as heresy, but as political rebellion. In 303 AD, he launched the Great Persecution, the most severe in Roman history. Churches were destroyed. Scriptures were burned. Thousands were imprisoned, tortured, and executed. It was meant to stamp Christianity out. It failed. The persecution, instead, scattered the faithful and hardened their resolve. It created martyrs, men and women, whose courage under torment inspired thousands more. The empire's attempt to erase Christianity only spread its flame wider. After Diocletian retired in 305 AD, one of the few emperors to ever voluntarily abdicate the tetrarchy collapsed into civil war. Generals vied for power. Provinces shifted loyalties. Among them was a man who would change the world: Constantine, the son of a Roman officer and a woman named Helena. Constantine was an outsider not born in Rome, but in the Balkans. He was a soldier, pragmatic, charismatic, and ruthless when needed. In 312 AD, he marched on Rome to confront his rival, Maxentius. What happened next became legend. On the eve of battle, Constantine claimed to see a vision in the sky, a cross of light and the words, "In this sign, conquer." He ordered his men to place the symbol on their shields. The next day, at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Constantine won a decisive victory. He entered Rome as a Christian conqueror. Whether the vision was divine or political, it marked a turning point. Constantine legalized Christianity through the Edict of Milan in 313 AD. Persecution ended, churches were restored, bishops gained prominence. Christianity, once a persecuted sect, became a state-sanctioned faith. In 324, Constantine became sole ruler of the Roman world, but he did not make Rome his capital. Instead, he looked east. An ancient Greek city called Byzantium nestled between Europe and Asia. There, on the Bosporus Strait, he built a new city, Constantinople, city of Constantine. It would become the heart of the Eastern Roman Empire. The location was perfect, defensible by sea, central to key trade routes, and symbolically separate from the corruption of old Rome. Constantinople was filled with Christian churches, lavish palaces, hippodromes, and wide avenues. It was Rome reborn but baptized. Constantine died in 337 AD, baptized only on his deathbed, but he left behind a radically transformed empire. The pagan gods were in retreat. The Senate mattered little. The Christian bishop, especially the Bishop of Rome, now held moral power over the hearts of men. The empire was no longer merely Roman, it was becoming Christian. After Constantine's death, his sons divided the empire. Civil war flared again, but the course was set. Even emperors who flirted with paganism, like Julian the Apostate, could not undo the Christian tide. Under Theodosius I, Christianity became the official state religion. In 380 AD, pagan rituals were banned, the Olympic Games were cancelled, temples were closed or converted. The empire's religious identity had flipped in just a few generations, but this unity came at a cost. The empire was not unified spiritually. Doctrinal disputes erupted. The nature of Christ, the Trinity, the relationship between Jesus and God the Father. Councils were called Nicaea, Chalcedon, Constantinople. Emperors took sides in theological debates, often creating more division. The emperor was now not just Caesar, but God's lieutenant on earth. By 395 Editha, the death of Theodosius I, the Roman world stood divided in geography, governance, and faith. The Western Empire was weaker, poorer, plagued by infighting, and increasingly reliant on barbarian troops. The Eastern Empire, centered in Constantinople, had money, trade, and a strong bureaucracy, yet both still called themselves Roman. This new Rome bore little resemblance to the Republic of Cicero or the Empire of Augustus. Its citizens worshipped in cathedrals, not temples. Its laws came from imperial decrees, not senatorial debate. Latin endured, but Greek dominated the East. Rome had not died, it had evolved. In the East, a new Rome stood cloaked in incense, crowned with crosses, guarded by gold and steel. It would endure storms the old empire never could. But it was not immortal. No empire is. In time, even the might of Constantinople would be tested by fire and blade. But that is a story for another time. After the death of Theodosius in 395 AD, the Roman world split, not only in governance, but in destiny. In the west, Rome staggered toward ruin. But in the east, in the city once called Byzantium, a second Rome endured. What rose from these ashes was not a mere echo of the past, but a new imperial vision forged in Christian steel and Greek flame. It would be known to history as the Byzantine Empire. The empire passed into the hands of Theodosius's sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west. It was a symbolic moment. Though they ruled as co-emperors, the split was now permanent. Arcadius governed from Constantinople, secure, rich, and deeply influenced by Eastern court traditions. In contrast, Honorius ruled the troubled west from Ravenna, increasingly powerless to stop the storms gathering around him. It was in this period that the character of the East began to change. It became more bureaucratic, more spiritual, and more Greek in culture. While Latin remained the official language of the court, Greek was the language of the streets, the churches, and the scholars. Over generations, the Eastern Empire would become a distinct civilization, a Christian, Roman empire deeply rooted in Hellenistic heritage. In the early 5th century, Constantinople saw a monumental engineering achievement: the Theodosian walls, stretching over 6 kilometers. These triple-layered stone fortifications protected the city from landward invasion. With moats, towers, and inner sanctuaries, they made the city nearly impregnable. These walls would stand for over 1,000 years, shrugging off attacks from Huns, Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, and even Crusaders. As the West crumbled under barbarian assaults, Constantinople became a fortress of civilization, holding the line against the dark tides of history. The city would become a symbol of unshaken power, a Rome renewed not by conquest, but by survival. But not all threats came with swords. The Eastern Empire faced doctrinal war within its own soul. Christianity, though now dominant, was far from unified. From the 5th to 6th centuries, theological debates split cities and empires. Argued that Christ had two distinct persons, human and divine. Monophysitism claimed he had only one nature, divine. The Council of Chalcedon, 451 AD, attempted to resolve the debate, but only inflamed tensions. These were not merely academic disputes, they caused riots, imperial edicts, and schisms that still echo today. Emperors were forced into the role of theological referees. Bishops held as much influence as generals. Religious identity became a question of loyalty, and the wrong belief could end one's career or life. Unlike the martial nobility of the Roman Republic, the Byzantine state was run by a complex civil bureaucracy. Emperors relied on highly educated officials, often eunuchs, whose lack of familial ambition made them more trustworthy to run the court, the treasury, and the imperial archives. Taxes were collected with ruthless precision. Every village, every crop, every craftsman was accounted for. The Byzantine gold solidus, introduced by Constantine, remained remarkably stable for centuries, a feat unmatched by any other medieval state. This administrative machine was what truly held the empire together when armies failed. Even in times of invasion or plague, the empire did not collapse because the system could flex and absorb shock. Rome in the East was not simply surviving, it was adapting. But even Constantinople was not immune to catastrophe. In 532 AD, under the reign of Justinian I, the city erupted into chaos. What began as a dispute between rival chariot racing factions, the Blues and the Greens, exploded into open revolt. For 5 days, The mob ruled the city, burning churches, palaces, and markets. Tens of thousands gathered in the hippodrome, calling for Justinian's overthrow. Terrified, Justinian considered fleeing, but his wife, Theodora, famously declared, "Purple is a fine color for a shroud." With that, he stayed. Justinian unleashed his generals Belisarius and Mundus on the rioters. In a single day, nearly 30,000 were killed in the hippodrome. The revolt was crushed, but the message was clear. Even emperors ruled by consent, and consent could be lost. Justinian, however, was not merely a survivor. He was a visionary. His ambition, restore the full glory of the Roman Empire. Under his command, General Belisarius led brilliant campaigns. In 533, the Vandals in North Africa were crushed. In 535 to 554, Italy was retaken from the Ostrogoths in a grinding, brutal war. Even parts of southern Spain fell under Byzantine banners. For a fleeting moment, the Mediterranean glittered again with Roman control, but this dream came at a heavy cost. The wars devastated Italy. Rome itself became a shadow, its population reduced to a few thousand. Constantinople, meanwhile, faced plague, earthquakes, and financial strain. The empire's resources were stretched thin. The dream of a reunited Roman Empire had returned, but only for a breath. Justinian's greatest legacy was not on the battlefield, but in the sky. After the Nika riots destroyed much of the city, Justinian ordered the construction of a new cathedral, Hagia Sophia, the Holy Wisdom. Completed in just 5 years, it became the largest church in Christendom, with a dome so vast it seemed to float on air. When Justinian entered its halls, he whispered, "Solomon, I have outdone you." This was no idle boast. Hagia Sophia became the beating heart of Orthodox Christianity for a millennium. Its golden mosaics, echoing chants, and celestial dome stood as testimony to the empire's divine authority. Rome was no longer a city, it was an idea. And in Hagia Sophia, that idea had found its sanctuary. In Justinian's reign, Rome was reborn, if only in shadow. The empire he ruled was no longer the one Augustus built, yet it bore its name, its ambition, and its soul. From the ashes of the West, a phoenix had risen in the East, a Christian Rome, a Byzantine Rome, a Rome that still dared to dream. But storms were coming from the sands of Arabia, the steppes of the East, and the ambitions of future emperors. The story of Rome was far from over. Rome did not fall in a day, nor did it vanish with a sword. For nearly 2 centuries after the Western Empire's collapse, the East endured. Yet, even in its survival, the Eastern Roman Empire, what we call Byzantium, was changing. The days of Justinian's glory were gone. What remained was an empire fighting not only for land, but for identity, for continuity, for breath. This is the story of Rome's twilight, not as a single moment, but as a drawn-out dusk, a slow unraveling of an ancient dream. When Justinian died in 565 AD, he left behind both triumph and exhaustion. Italy, devastated by the Gothic wars, was nominally back under imperial control, but its cities lay in ruins. North Africa, reclaimed from the Vandals, seethed with Berber revolts. The treasury, once full, had been drained by war and grand construction. The capital, still glorious, bore scars of plague, riots, and overtaxation. Justinian's vision had reached too far, and it would fall to his successors to defend a brittle dream against forces he could not have foreseen. His successor, Justin II, struggled to manage the legacy. Unlike Justinian, he lacked strategic patience. The empire was under pressure from all sides. In the east, the Sassanid Persians pushed into Mesopotamia and Syria. In the west, the Lombards invaded northern Italy, seizing large swaths of territory. Internally, the plague still haunted cities, draining the population and workforce. To make matters worse, Justin II's mental stability deteriorated. He fell into bouts of rage, paranoia, and eventually madness. His wife, the Empress Sophia, effectively ruled for a time, but the center was weakening. The greatest threat to Byzantium in this period came from its ancient eastern rival, the Sassanid Empire. Under Khosrow I and later Khosrow II, the Persians launched devastating campaigns deep into Byzantine lands. Entire cities were razed, fortresses fell. The once strong eastern frontier began to fracture, but the Byzantines fought back. In 582, a general named Maurice rose to prominence. He stabilized the Balkans, pushed back the Avars, and struck hard at Persia. When he became emperor in 590, it seemed a new age might dawn. Maurice was disciplined, reform-minded, and courageous. But he was also austere, refusing to spend on lavish public shows. The people resented his frugality. The army, tired of campaigns and unpaid wages, mutinied. In 602, Maurice was overthrown and executed, along with his 6 sons. His murder shattered morale. It also opened the floodgates for the empire's most catastrophic war. The usurper Phocas was a brutal and paranoid ruler, hated by nobles and peasants alike. His rule coincided with an apocalyptic invasion from the east. Khosrow II of Persia, claiming to avenge Maurice, launched a massive offensive. Over the next decade, Persian armies captured Antioch, Damascus, Jerusalem in 614 AD, where they seized the true cross from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Egypt, by 619 AD, the empire's grain basket was lost. It was the greatest loss of territory since the fall of the Western Empire. Byzantium teetered on the edge. But from this chaos rose one of the greatest emperors in Roman history, a general's son from Carthage. Heraclius sailed to Constantinople in 610 AD, overthrew Phocas, and took the crown. The empire he inherited was fractured, demoralized, and nearly bankrupt. Heraclius faced overwhelming odds. The Persians were entrenched in the east. The Balkans were overrun by Slavs and Avars. The treasury was empty, the army broken. Yet Heraclius did not flinch. He reorganized the military by recruiting directly from provincial landholders. He restructured the provinces into themes military districts governed by strategoi or generals. This system would become the backbone of Byzantine survival for centuries. Then, in a daring series of winter campaigns, he did what no one thought possible. He marched deep into Persian territory, striking at the heart of the enemy. Between 622 and 627, Heraclius led lightning strikes across the Caucasus and Mesopotamia. His victories were stunning. In 627, at the Battle of Nineveh, he destroyed the Persian army. Khosrow II was overthrown by his own court. The Persians sued for peace. The true cross was returned. The empire breathed again. But the price of victory was steep. The war had drained both empires. Cities were burned, populations displaced, economies shattered. And in the deserts of Arabia, a new force was rising, while Byzantium and Persia tore each other apart. A prophet named Muhammad had united the Arab tribes under a new faith, Islam. In 632 AD, Prophet Muhammad died, but his followers carried his message beyond the Arabian Peninsula. They exploded outward with astonishing speed and fervor. In 636, at the Battle of Yarmouk, a vastly outnumbered Muslim army shattered Byzantine forces in Syria. Jerusalem fell again in 638, this time to Caliph Umar. Egypt was retaken this time not by Rome, but by Islam. The Sassanid Empire, weakened and leaderless, collapsed entirely by 651 AD, in less than 2 decades. Byzantium lost its richest province Assyria, Palestine, and Egypt forever. This was more than a military loss. It was a civilizational shift. The Christian Roman world had become a frontier to the Islamic Caliphate. The old trade routes were disrupted. The flow of grain from Egypt halted. The empire, once Mediterranean, now became a Balkan and Anatolian state. By 641 AD, when Heraclius died, the empire he saved had become something new. It still called itself Roman, but the world it ruled had changed forever. Greek, not Latin, was now the official language. The provinces of the old Roman world were gone, replaced by semi-autonomous themes. Emperors ruled with the cross as well as the sword. A new religion had risen to challenge them, not pagan, but monotheistic and confident. The Eastern Roman Empire had survived, but it was no longer the empire of Augustus or Constantine. It was something else, a new Rome, forged in fire and faith. Byzantium had endured the storm, but the age of empire was fading. In the crucible of war, faith, and loss, the ancient dream had been recast. Rome had not fallen, but it had become something else, something older, wiser, and more alone. The empire was bruised, bleeding, but still alive. Byzantium had endured the Persian wars, the Arab conquests, and the near extinction of Rome's ancient order. Yet, in survival came crisis, not just of power or territory, but of identity. The empire would now face a battle not on its borders, but within its churches, its palaces, its soul. This was a war of symbols, a war of meaning, a war of icons. After the death of Heraclius in 641, the Byzantine Empire had fundamentally changed. No longer a pan-Mediterranean giant, it had shrunk into a compact realm focused on Asia Minor, modern Turkey, the Balkans, and parts of southern Italy. Gone were the wealthy provinces of Egypt, Syria, and the Levant, now under the control of the Rashidun and Umayyad caliphates. Constantinople remained a beacon, but its empire had become a fortress, one braced against both physical siege and spiritual crisis. With fewer resources and a smaller army, survival now depended on adaptation. The theme system, first introduced by Heraclius, grew in importance. Soldiers were settled on frontier lands and expected to fight for them. This gave the army a deeply local character, but also made it harder to control from the center. Even worse, the emperors now faced continuous war against the Arabs, Slavs, and Bulgars almost every year. The empire would not know peace for centuries. In 674, the Umayyad Caliphate launched one of the greatest threats in Byzantine history, a naval siege of Constantinople. For 4 years, Arab fleets blockaded the city from spring to autumn. It seemed the end had finally come. But Constantinople possessed 3 unmatched advantages. The Theodosian walls, still impregnable after 2 centuries. A new weapon, Greek fire, a petroleum-based liquid that could be ignited on water and launched from ships or tubes. A resilient, disciplined people. Greek fire turned the tide. Arab ships burst into flame, panic spread, and by 678, the Umayyads withdrew. The empire had survived the greatest naval siege the world had ever seen. The success was hailed as divine. The emperor, Constantine IV, became a symbol of endurance. A treaty was signed, and for a time, the eastern frontier quieted. In the early 8th century, a new and shocking movement swept the empire, iconoclasm literally, the breaking of images. It began under Emperor Leo III, 717 to 741, a capable ruler who saved the empire from another massive Arab siege in 717 to 718. Yet despite his military successes, Leo believed that divine favor was slipping, and he had an idea why: idolatry. Influenced by both Islamic aniconism and Old Testament prohibitions, Leo outlawed the veneration of religious icons, the painted images of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints that filled Byzantine churches and homes. He ordered them removed, destroyed, burned. Mosaics were scraped from walls, frescoes whitewashed, monks arrested. Entire monasteries were defunded or demolished. To many common people, especially in the East, this seemed pious. But in the cities, especially Constantinople and the Greek-speaking provinces, it sparked fury. The church was thrown into chaos. Two camps now divided the empire: iconoclasts, who believed that venerating images was idolatrous, who believed icons were windows to the divine, not objects of worship. The debate wasn't merely theological, it was political. Emperors favored iconoclasm as a way to assert control over the church. Monasteries, which supported icons, were also powerful landowners, so suppressing icons weakened their economic influence. A century of unrest followed. Civil wars, riots, councils and counter-councils. Popes in Rome broke ties with Constantinople over the issue. Even the empresses became warriors in this battle of belief. In the late 8th century, one woman would shape the fate of the empire: Irene of Athens. She rose from obscurity to become the wife of Emperor Leo IV. When he died, she ruled as regent for her son, Constantine VI. Eventually, she deposed and blinded her own son to rule in her own name, the first woman to rule Byzantium alone. But Irene is remembered not only for her ambition but for her faith. In 787 AD, she called the Second Council of Nicaea, which restored the veneration of icons at least temporarily. The decision was celebrated in the East and West alike. For a moment, it seemed unity might return. But the scars of iconoclasm ran deep, and Irene's reign ended in intrigue and exile. In the early 9th century, a second wave of iconoclasm erupted under Leo V and his successors. Once again, icons were banned, churches stripped, and monks imprisoned. But resistance simmered. In 843 AD, under Empress Theodora, icons were finally and permanently restored, a moment still celebrated in the Eastern Orthodox Church as the triumph of orthodoxy. The icon, once a source of conflict, would become the defining art of Byzantium, its theology, its identity, its soul. As the 9th century closed, Byzantium entered a new phase, not one of expansion yet, but of stabilization. A new dynasty emerged: the Macedonians, beginning with Basil I 867 to 886. Basil was a peasant-born stable-boy who rose through cunning, marriage, and murder. He became emperor after allegedly killing his co-emperor, Michael III, in his sleep. Despite his brutal rise, Basil founded a dynasty that would preside over a revival of Byzantine culture, military strength, and law. The empire had weathered iconoclasm, Arab invasions, civil strife, and economic ruin. Now it stood on the cusp of a Byzantine renaissance. But for that, we must wait. The image was saved. The empire endured, against sword and flame, heresy, and hunger, Byzantium clung to life not as a remnant, but as a reborn vision. In mosaics and manuscripts, a new Rome glimmered in the dark. But the world was changing still. A new challenge would rise from the Bulgars, the Rus, and from within, the palace itself. For centuries, Byzantium had survived siege and schism. She had buried emperors and outlasted enemies. Now, in the late 9th century, she would do something rare in history. She would rise again. Under a line of shrewd, ambitious rulers, Macedonian dynasty, the Empire of Rome experienced one final bloom of power, wealth, and intellectual glory. It was not the Rome of legions and Caesars, but it was unmistakably Roman. The dynasty began not with a nobleman, but a man of humble birth. Basil the firstborn, a peasant in Macedonia, Basil rose through wit, charm, and calculated violence. He gained favor with Emperor Michael III, married into the court, and eventually assassinated his benefactor to seize the throne. Yet Basil wasn't just a usurper, he was a reformer. He reorganized imperial finances, codified law in a massive work known as the Basilica, written in Greek, not Latin, a defining cultural shift, encouraged church restoration, supported monastic life, and centralized imperial authority. When he died in 886, he left a stabilized realm ready for growth. His son, Leo VI, called the Wise, embodied the intellectual spirit of the revival. A scholar emperor, Leo, revised and expanded the law code, composed poetry, homilies, and even military manuals, rebuilt the Hagia Sophia's dome after an earthquake, strengthened the bureaucracy, creating a model that would last for centuries. But Leo also struggled with political problems. He married 4 times in an attempt to produce a legitimate heir, creating a scandal that shook the church. Yet his vision of a learned emperor, ruling by both sword and scripture, shaped the Byzantine image for the century to come. The 10th and early 11th centuries brought military glory. Byzantine arms once again thundered across Syria, Mesopotamia, and Armenia. The army, now hardened by centuries of defense, went on the offensive. Nicephorus Phocas, a brilliant general, reconquered Crete in 961, restoring security to the Aegean. He pushed deep into Muslim-held Syria, capturing Antioch in 969, a major Christian stronghold lost for over 3 centuries, though unpopular. With the aristocracy, Nicephorus symbolized a return to imperial might. Then came the greatest emperor of the dynasty, Basil II, known as the Bulgar Slayer. Basil II r. 976-1025 ruled for nearly 50 years. He was ascetic, ruthless, and tireless. He rarely visited Constantinople's luxuries, preferring the saddle to the throne. He focused on one thing: military domination. He campaigned year after year against the Bulgar kingdom in the Balkans, ultimately annexing Bulgaria in 1018 after a series of brutal, calculated campaigns. He reorganized the provinces, broke the power of the landed aristocracy, and reinforced the peasantry who provided the bulk of imperial taxes and soldiers. He amassed a huge surplus in the treasury, leaving Byzantium at its wealthiest in centuries. Yet Basil never married. He died childless in 1025, leaving behind an empire at its peak and a fragile succession. While Basil conquered, others built. Art and architecture flourished. The cross-and-square church designs spread across the empire. Monasteries like Hosios, Laukas, and Neomone were adorned with mosaics of exquisite beauty. Manuscript production exploded. Greek classics were copied, commented on, and preserved. Diplomacy reached into the Slavic world. Cyril and Methodius, missionaries to the Slavs, had already created the Glagolitic alphabet, the precursor to Cyrillic, planting Orthodox Christianity in Russia, Serbia, and Bulgaria. In Constantinople, the university trained scholars and theologians. The city teemed with merchants, theologians, artisans, and eunuchs. From the Golden Horn to the Great Palace, Byzantium shimmered with gold and incense. This was a true Renaissance, long before the Italian one. Yet beneath the splendor, cracks formed after Basil II, his weak successors, is in name, not spirits, squandered his treasury. Powerful noble families regained influence, slowly dominating the provinces. The theme system began to collapse under their weight. The military was neglected, relying increasingly on foreign mercenaries, Normans, Pechenegs, even Vikings. Enemies gathered. The Seljuk Turks had emerged in Central Asia and now threatened the empire's eastern flank. Then, in 1071, came the Battle of Manzikert. In 1071, Emperor Romanos for Diogenes marched east to confront the rising Seljuk Turks under Alp Arslan. What followed was one of Byzantium's greatest defeats. Romanos was betrayed by his own generals. His army collapsed. He was captured and later mutilated and deposed in Constantinople. But worse than the battle itself was the aftermath. The heartland of Anatolia, once the empire's military and agricultural base, was overrun by Turkish nomads. Within a generation, much of Asia Minor was lost. The empire was fractured between generals, warlords, and foreign mercenaries. Constantinople remained unfallen, but now sat isolated, surrounded by lost provinces and broken faith. In 1081, a new emperor seized the throne, Alexios I Komnenos. He was energetic, charismatic, and realistic. He knew Byzantium could not recover alone. In 1095, he sent a desperate appeal to the West to Pope Urban II, asking for mercenaries to help repel the Turks from Anatolia. Instead, he got something far greater: the First Crusade. The empire had risen again, but the world had changed. The tide of Islam surged to the east. Latin crusaders marched from the west, and the ancient dream of Rome stood caught between sword and salvation. The stage was set for a new chapter, one of crusade, betrayal, and eventual collapse. Byzantium had stood for more than 700 years longer, even than Rome itself. Its domes still shimmered, its palaces still gleamed. But by the end of the 11th century, the empire was no longer what it had been. Asia Minor, its heartland, had been overrun. The treasury had been drained. The army was a patchwork of mercenaries. Enemies pressed from all sides. In desperation, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos looked westward for help. What he received would change the world. In 1071, the catastrophic Battle of Manzikert had shattered Byzantine control over Anatolia. The Seljuk Turks, Turkic nomads recently converted to Islam, flooded across the plateau, though the Emperor Romanos IV was captured and later deposed. The deeper damage lay in the empire's loss of its core provinces. For centuries, Asia Minor had been Byzantium's breadbasket and recruiting ground. Now, much of it belonged to the Sultanate of Rum, a new Turkish power with its capital at Nicaea, just 100 kilometers from Constantinople. The Komnenoi family rose in response to this chaos. Alexios I Komnenos, crowned in 1081, was a man of deep political instinct, charismatic, cunning, and tirelessly energetic. He had clawed his way to power through civil war. He inherited a broken state, and for 2 decades he rebuilt it. He forged alliances with the Venetians, granting them trading privileges in exchange for naval support. He tamed rebellious generals, stabilized the coinage, and fought off the Normans, Pechenegs, and Turks with a mixture of diplomacy and force. Yet he lacked one thing: manpower. To retake Anatolia, Alexios needed soldiers. Byzantine armies were depleted. Greek peasants had fled Turkish-controlled lands. The emperor needed foreign warriors and, so, in 1095, he reached out to the Pope. Alexios sent emissaries to Pope Urban II, asking for mercenaries to help fight the Turks. He offered them gold, glory, and indulgences. Urban saw an opportunity. The Pope was embroiled in the investiture controversy with the Holy Roman Emperor. His authority in Europe was contested. A grand, sacred cause war to liberate Jerusalem from Muslim control could rally Christendom under his spiritual leadership. At the Council of Clermont in 1095, Pope Urban II gave a sermon that changed the course of history. "God wills it," he cried. "Take up the cross and fight for the Holy Land." What Alexios had hoped would be a few thousand professional fighters became something far more dangerous and unpredictable: the First Crusade. Before professional armies could even mobilize an untrained, impassioned mass of peasants, minor nobles, and adventurers surged eastward, led by Peter the Hermit. This People's Crusade reached Constantinople in 1096, a chaotic, ill-equipped rabble of 20,000 to 30,000. Alexios, alarmed by their disorder, ferried them across the Bosporus as quickly as possible, hoping the Turks would deal with them, and they did. The People's Crusade was massacred outside Nicaea. Few survived. Yet the real armies of the Crusade were still on their way. In the fall of 1096, the true lords of the First Crusade began to arrive. Godfrey of Bouillon, Bohemond of Taranto, Raymond of Toulouse, Baldwin of Boulogne, Tancred, Robert of Normandy, and many others. These were no rabble. They were hardened knights, accompanied by thousands of retainers, archers, cooks, and squires. Some came for faith, others for land. Many came for both. Alexios, wary of their intentions, insisted each commander swear an oath of fealty, promising to return any conquered Byzantine territory. Most reluctantly agreed. Alexios provided them with guides and supplies and, then, like before, ferried them across the Bosporus. Now began a march that would become legend. The first major target was Nicaea, capital of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum. The city was heavily fortified, protected by lakes and walls. The Crusaders besieged it for weeks, but Alexios, acting quietly, negotiated a surrender with the city's Turkish defenders behind the Crusaders' backs. When the city opened its gates, it was not to the Crusaders but to the Byzantines. The Crusader leaders were furious. They had expected loot and plunder. Instead, the emperor took the city peacefully and prevented the pillaging. This tension between allies on paper and rivals in ambition would define the relationship between Byzantium and the Crusaders for decades. Despite the betrayal, the Crusaders pressed onward. With Byzantine guides and a joint campaign strategy, they moved east. They defeated the Turks at Dorylaeum, securing a major victory. Baldwin of Boulogne broke away to carve his own principality in Edessa, the first Crusader state. The armies pressed into Syria, heading for the ultimate prize, Jerusalem. Alexios, fearing betrayal, refused to send the full Byzantine army further east. He remained in Anatolia, consolidating gains, but to the Crusaders, this looked like cowardice, even treachery. Alexios, I never saw Jerusalem liberated. In 1099, the Crusaders took the Holy City in a massacre that stunned even contemporary Christians. Muslims and Jews were slaughtered by the thousands. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was declared, with Godfrey as its first ruler. To many in the West, the crusade was a triumph. To Byzantium, it was a missed opportunity and a growing threat. Now Latin knights held vast territories once claimed by Byzantium. Tensions rose. Alexios I spent his final years trying to reclaim Anatolia and manage his ambitious relatives. He survived plot after plot, illness after illness, ruling until 1118. Alexios had saved the empire, but only barely. He had bought time, not triumph. The Crusades had begun as an alliance, but their fire could not be controlled. The world was shifting again. The West had returned to the East and it would not leave quietly. When Alexios, the first Komnenos, died in 1118, he left behind a battered but breathing empire. Byzantium had survived the Turks. It had endured the chaos of the First Crusade. But the world around it had changed. Latin Crusader states now ringed its eastern borders. Turkish principalities still infested Anatolia. The Komnenian Empire stood at a crossroads between diplomacy and war, between East and West, between survival and resurgence. The new emperor, John II Komnenos, son of Alexios, was unlike many of his predecessors. He was devout but not dogmatic, intelligent but not ostentatious. A tireless campaigner, he would spend much of his 25-year reign on the move, fighting, negotiating, and restoring imperial authority. John lacked the flamboyance of Roman emperors past. Later historians would call him John the Good, a man who put empire before ego. His reign would be one of slow, deliberate revival. When John came to power, he inherited a Byzantine empire surrounded by volatile powers. To the south, the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, founded by Crusaders, ruled the Holy Land. To the east, Turkish warlords carved Anatolia into warring emirates. To the west, the Normans still eyed Byzantine lands in the Balkans and southern Italy. To the north, the Pechenegs and Cumans lingered on the steppes. John approached each problem not as a conqueror, but as a chess master. He maintained careful, if tense, relations with the Crusader states. He launched annual campaigns into Anatolia, regaining city by city what had been lost after Manzikert. He fought off repeated incursions from nomads along the Danube. He oversaw fortification programs, treasury reform, and the professionalization of the Byzantine army. Unlike the Crusader kings, John did not rely on glory or miracles. His victories were slow, methodical, and unromantic, but they worked. Between 1119 and 1130, John II waged a long campaign to reclaim the imperial heartland, western and central Anatolia. He recaptured Laodicea, Sozopollis, and Attaleia, vital towns lost to the Turks. He pushed deep into Phrygia and Pisidia, rebuilding garrisons and repopulating cities with Greek settlers. He skillfully used diplomacy to pit rival Turkish emirates against each other. His use of mixed diplomacy and war was classic Byzantine statecraft, but John executed it with unmatched discipline. He avoided overextension, never gambled with the army, and prioritized imperial cohesion over conquest. John's real diplomatic test came in the Levant. The Crusader state, Antioch, Edessa, Tripoli, and Jerusalem, had technically sworn fealty to Byzantium, but in practice they acted as independent kingdoms, often ignoring or undermining imperial authority. John sought to reassert that authority. In 1137, he led a major campaign into Syria, bringing with him both Byzantine and Crusader forces. He demanded homage from the Prince of Antioch, Raymond of Poitiers, who reluctantly complied. John entered Antioch in triumph, a rare moment of real Byzantine power in the Levant. But when he pushed toward Aleppo, cooperation faltered. The Crusaders dragged their feet, unwilling to see Byzantine flags flying in Syria. Some historians argue that the Latins even sabotaged the campaign. Frustrated, John withdrew, though not before asserting imperial rights over Antioch, a city long claimed by both East and West. The episode foreshadowed deeper betrayals to come. In 1142, John launched his most ambitious campaign yet, a renewed push into Cilicia and northern Syria, aimed at reinforcing imperial presence in the east and possibly mounting a joint campaign to reclaim Jerusalem. He brought with him not only soldiers, but his heir, Alexios, and a large imperial entourage. The campaign moved swiftly, capturing several key fortresses and pressuring local lords to submit. But fate intervened. In 1143, while hunting near the Taurus Mountains, John suffered a fatal accident, a minor arrow wound that turned septic. After more than 2 decades of rule, Byzantium's quiet, strategic emperor died in a tent far from home. John II left behind a Byzantine empire stronger, safer, and richer than it had been in generations. Anatolia was partially restored, the Balkan frontier had stabilized, the military had been rebuilt, the court had regained its dignity and discipline. But John's greatest gift was intangible. He bought time. His son, Manuel I Komnenos, would inherit a realm not in decline but on the cusp of a renaissance. Yet Manuel's reign would be very different: flamboyant, cosmopolitan, ambitious to a fault. The empire had survived the storm, but the wind was shifting again. The Crusaders grew restless. The Turks regrouped, and in the heart of Byzantium, ambition returned. The stage was set for dazzling triumph and devastating fall. The torch passed to Manuel I Komnenos in 1143, marked more than a succession. It ushered in a transformation. Where John II had ruled with caution and strategy, Manuel ruled with vision and spectacle. Where his father had seen the West as a threat, Manuel saw it as a stage. His reign would be filled with triumphs, treaties, and tournaments, but beneath the glittering facade, cracks widened. The empire was rich in appearance, but brittle in substance. The world was changing faster than Byzantium could adapt. Manuel Komnenos, crowned at 24, was the quintessential Byzantine knight emperor, handsome, athletic, multilingual, and charismatic. He saw himself as the equal of Western kings and, often their superior. He surrounded himself with Latin knights, wore Western armor, and adopted chivalric customs. He sought to dominate both East and West, projecting Byzantine power across Europe and the Levant. His court dazzled with wealth and culture, and imperial theater designed to impress and intimidate. For a time, it worked. Manuel held the allegiance, or at least the respect, of kings from Hungary, Sicily, Jerusalem, and Venice. He conducted diplomacy with flair, often dazzling ambassadors with golden halls, choreographed ceremonies, and lavish gifts. But he was playing a dangerous game. In the Balkans, Manuel waged constant campaigns to reassert Byzantine dominance. In Serbia, he enforced suzerainty through marriage alliances and military intervention. In Hungary, he fought repeated wars, occupying Sirmia and influencing Hungarian succession. His campaigns against the Normans of Sicily under King William I culminated in the Battle of Sirmium, 1167, a costly but decisive Byzantine victory. Yet for all this effort, gains were temporary. Manuel's victories in the Balkans drained the treasury and tied up his best forces. Every war fought in Europe weakened Byzantium's hand in the east. In 1147, the Second Crusade swept through Byzantium. Unlike the First Crusade, this one was organized by kings Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany. Both marched through Byzantine territory to reach the Holy Land, and both viewed the empire with suspicion. Manuel, ever the diplomat, welcomed them with honor, but kept a wary distance. He feared the Crusaders would seize Byzantine lands under the pretense of aiding Jerusalem, and he was right to worry. Tensions flared. Western armies clashed with locals. Manuel insisted they cross into Asia Minor quickly, offering guides but letting Turkish ambushes weaken them along the way. The Second Crusade failed catastrophically in the Levant, but for Manuel, it was a strategic success. The West had weakened itself, and Byzantium remained standing. Manuel's ambition knew no bounds. He married Bertha of Sulzbach, a German princess, strengthening ties to the Holy Roman Empire. Later, he sought marriage alliances with the royal houses of France, Hungary, and Jerusalem. He dreamed of restoring Byzantine control over Italy, Dalmatia, and even Rome. In 1155, he launched a massive expedition to southern Italy, briefly occupying key Norman cities. Byzantine banners flew over Apulia and Calabria, but the dream was short-lived. By 1158, the campaign collapsed under Norman counterattacks. The expedition drained imperial coffers and emboldened enemies. The West had shown its teeth and Manuel had overreached. By the 1170s, Manuel turned east once again, seeking to break Turkish power once and for all. The Sultanate of Rum, under Kilij Arslan II, had grown strong. Manuel sought to crush it, just as Romanos IV had tried a century earlier at Manzikert. History repeated itself. In 1176, the Byzantine army marched deep into Anatolia. At the narrow pass of Myriochelon, they were ambushed. Manuel's forces, trapped in a mountain gorge, were devastated. His siege engines were destroyed. His dream of retaking central Anatolia evaporated. Though not as fatal as Manzikert, Myriochelon was a turning point. The Byzantines would never again mount a serious offensive in Anatolia. The frontier was lost permanently. Behind the brilliant court ceremonies and military campaigns, signs of decay spread. The imperial treasury, emptied by endless wars and grand projects, could no longer sustain the Comnenian system. Latin mercenaries, expensive and unreliable, filled the ranks of the army. Greek aristocrats, jealous of Latin influence at court, grew restless. Provincial administration weakened, and local corruption flourished. The once powerful Byzantine navy fell into decline. Outpaced by Venice and Genoa, even Manuel's own court was a house divided. Latins and Greeks, reformers and traditionalists, competed for influence. The emperor's infatuation with Western culture alienated many in the Orthodox elite. In 1180, Manuel died at the age of 61. On his deathbed, he wore a monk's robe and renounced the vanities of empire. But the damage was done. He left the empire to his 11-year-old son, Alexios II, under the regency of his Latin wife, Maria of Antioch. The court erupted in factional conflict. Manuel had built an empire of appearances, shining palaces, dazzling diplomacy, theatrical victories. But beneath the surface, Byzantium was stretched thin, its unity fraying, its enemies circling. Manuel Comnenos dreamed of a universal empire, but left behind a realm brittle and divided. His triumphs glimmered like gold, but underneath lay rust. And soon, from within his own house, would come a storm Byzantium could not survive. When Manuel I Komnenos died in 1180, the golden court of Byzantium dimmed. The empire, held together by force of personality and sheer spectacle, now stood leaderless, ruled in name by an 11-year-old Alexios II, in practice by his Latin mother, Maria of Antioch. But the empire was no nursery, and into this void stepped a man who embodied both Byzantine brilliance and brutality, Andronikos, the first Komnenos. The years after Manuel's death were marked by uncertainty and resentment. The regency of Maria of Antioch, a Latin noblewoman, infuriated the Orthodox populace. Corruption bloomed at court. Latin merchants wielded enormous power, especially the Venetians. The young emperor Alexios II was barely seen hidden behind advisors, priests, and aristocrats. To the people, it seemed Byzantium had lost its soul, and in that vacuum rose Andronikos Komnenos, a cousin of the Komnenoi, exiled and disgraced, but clever, charming, and ruthless. In 1182, Andronikos returned from exile. He marched on Constantinople, claiming to protect the young emperor and cleanse the empire of corruption. The people welcomed him mat first. Crowds cheered as his army entered the city. Within days, the Latin regency was overthrown, and Maria of Antioch was executed. But the triumph turned sour. That same year, Constantinople witnessed one of the most shameful moments in its history: the massacre of the Latins. Thousands of Italian Catholics, merchants, priests, women, children, were slaughtered by mobs in the streets. The government did nothing to stop it. Many even encouraged it. The Western world never forgot. Andronicus crowned himself co-emperor, then sole ruler, after having young Alexios II strangled. He claimed the mantle of reformer and, for a brief time, delivered. He punished corrupt officials with public mutilations and executions. He reigned in aristocratic power, restoring some central authority. He tried to root out the lavish waste of imperial spending, but Andronikos ruled by terror. He trusted no one. Torture, spying, and purges became routine. He killed potential rivals by the dozens, many Komnenoi, many innocent. His reign of fear turned allies into enemies, the people into plotters. And most dangerously, he underestimated the West. In 1185, King William II of Sicily, enraged by the massacre of Latins, launched a massive invasion. 30,000 men, 200 ships, one of the largest assaults Byzantium had seen in a century. Thessaloniki, the empire's second city, was sacked. Tens of thousands died. The Normans marched toward Constantinople. The people panicked. The court cracked. Andronikos, hated and isolated, tried to flee but was captured. In a horrifying scene of public revenge, he was tortured, mutilated, and torn apart by a mob in Constantinople. His death was the end of an era. Komnenian rule was over. The empire now belonged to the Angeloi. The brothers Isaac to Angelos 1185 to 1195, 1203 to 1204, and Alexios, 3 Angelos, 1195 to 1203, ruled Byzantium during its final spiral before the Fourth Crusade. They were not monsters, but they were incompetent, greedy, and short-sighted. The treasury was looted to pay bribes and fund weddings. The military crumbled from neglect. Provinces slipped away. Bulgarians revolted. Turks advanced. The navy disintegrated. Venice dominated the seas. And most fatally, they alienated the West again. When Frederick Barbarossa led the Third Crusade, The Byzantines saw him as a threat. Tensions soared, trust collapsed. Byzantium, once the guardian of Christendom, now seemed to the Latins like a snaker proud, backstabbing relic of a fallen Rome. In 1203, Isaac's exiled son, Alexios IV, convinced Western crusaders stalled in Venice to help him reclaim the throne. He promised them vast sums of Byzantine gold, troops for their war in the Holy Land, church unity between Rome and Constantinople. The Fourth Crusade, originally meant for Egypt, now turned toward Byzantium. The Crusaders, detridden and manipulated by Venice, led by the cunning Doge Enrico, Dandalos our new prize, the queen of cities, and Alexios, for delivered none of his promises. The people of Constantinople rioted. He was deposed, and the West prepared for war. Byzantium had survived Persians, Arabs, and Turks, but it could not survive itself. The final blow would not come from the East but from the very allies who once prayed before its walls. The gates would soon fall, and the eagle would weep. In the spring of 1204, the city of Constantinople, once the heart of the Eastern Roman Empire, stood as a shadow of its former self. Its domes and towers still rose over the Bosphorus with majestic pride. The golden mosaics of Hagia Sophia still reflected the light of heaven, and the mighty Theodosian walls still embraced the city like a stone crown. Yet inside those walls, the empire was bleeding from within. Its emperors were weak, its politics corrupted, and its people weary of broken promises. 1,000 years had passed since Constantine the Great had dreamed of a new Rome. But by the dawn of the 13th century, that dream was flickering in the wind. The tragedy that would soon engulf the city was not a tale of foreign conquest alone, but of betrayal, greed, and a crusade gone horribly astray. The Fourth Crusade had begun, like those before it, with a sacred mission to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control. But unlike the campaigns of earlier decades, this crusade never reached Jerusalem. Instead, through a complex web of debt, deception, and political intrigue, it veered disastrously off course, targeting the heart of Christendom itself. The chain of calamities began with the Republic of Venice, a maritime empire ruled by merchants and driven by profit. The Crusaders had contracted the Venetians to build a massive fleet for their journey to the Levant. But when only a fraction of the expected knights arrived, and even fewer paid their share, the Crusaders found themselves in crippling debt. The Doge of Venice, the aged and nearly blind Enrico Dandolo, proposed a solution. If the Crusaders helped Venice capture the rebellious Christian city of Zara, their debt would be forgiven. Desperate and leaderless, the Crusaders agreed. Zara was sacked, the first Christian city ever taken by a crusading army. The stain of Zara was soon followed by an even darker proposition. In the shadows of Western courts and monasteries, an exiled Byzantine prince named Alexios IV approached the Crusaders. His father, Isaac II, had been deposed and blinded in a palace coup in Constantinople. Alexios offered vast wealth, military assistance, and church unification under the Pope if the Crusaders would help him reclaim the throne. Tempted by promises of silver and divine favor, the Crusaders diverted their fleet once more, this time toward the great city of Constantinople. In the summer of 1203, the Crusaders arrived at the gates of the Byzantine capital. The walls of Constantinople, though aged, were still formidable, triple-layered, fortified with towers, and defended by the deep waters of the Golden Horn. But within the city, the ruling emperor, Alexios III, was paralyzed by cowardice. As panic spread, he fled into exile, and the Crusaders installed young Alexios IV and his father, Isaac II, as co-emperors, but the promise of unity quickly turned to resentment. Alexios IV was seen by the people as a Latin puppet, a foreign-backed usurper who taxed the population into ruin to pay debts to his Western allies. Riots erupted. Churches were desecrated by enraged mobs. Tensions between Greeks and Latins, already strained by centuries of theological rivalry, exploded into violence. In early 1204, a Byzantine noble named Alexios Doukas seized the throne. Becoming Emperor Alexios V, he imprisoned and executed Alexios IV, fortified the city, and defied the Crusaders camped outside the walls. The fragile alliance collapsed. What had begun as a holy war now devolved into open war between Christians. On April 12, 1204, the Crusaders launched their final assault on the city. The attack was brutal. Fire arrows lit up the sky as siege towers crashed against the seawalls. The defenders fought valiantly, but after fierce clashes at the Bloschany quarter, the Latins broke through. Once inside, the sack began, and with it, one of the darkest chapters in Christian history. For 3 days, Constantinople was plunged into horror. Churches that had stood since the days of Justinian were looted and burned. The Hagia Sophia, once the most sacred cathedral in Christendom, was desecrated. Latin soldiers rode horses through its marble floors while chalices were stolen and the altar was shattered. Priceless icons were hacked apart, their gold scraped off and melted down. Monasteries were pillaged. Nuns were raped. Priests were killed in front of their flocks. Relics of unimaginable importance, said to include fragments of the true cross, the crown of thorns, and saintly bones, were looted and shipped to Europe. Venice took the bronze horses of the Hippodrome, mounting them above the Basilica of St. Mark, where they remain today as silent witnesses to the destruction. It was not just a city that fell, it was a civilization. The empire that had preserved Roman law, Greek culture, and Christian theology for nearly a millennium was torn apart, not by Muslims, but by fellow Christians. The Pope, upon hearing of the sack, expressed horror, but also gratitude that the Eastern Church might finally be brought under Latin control. But instead of unification, the sack created a chasm that would never be healed. The Orthodox Church was alienated forever. The West had not liberated Constantinople, it had mutilated it. In the ashes of the city, the victors carved up the spoils. The Latin Empire of Constantinople was declared, with Baldwin of Flanders crowned as emperor. Venice took vast swaths of territory, including ports, islands, and trade routes. Byzantine nobles who escaped the sack fled to the provinces, establishing breakaway states, the Empire of Nicaea in western Anatolia, the Despotate of Epirus in the Balkans, and the Empire of Trebizond along the Black Sea. Each claimed to be the true successor of Rome, but all were shadows of what had come before. The Latin Empire, for all its pomp, was built on sand. Its rulers were Latin warlords, unfamiliar with Byzantine customs and hated by the Orthodox population. Economically crippled, politically isolated, and surrounded by enemies, it staggered on for barely 5 decades. In 1261, Byzantine forces from Nicaea recaptured Constantinople under Emperor Michael VIII Palaiologos. The empire was reborn, but its soul had been wounded beyond healing. What the sack of 1204 destroyed was not just buildings and relics. It shattered the illusion that Christendom was united. It showed the world that even the most sacred city could fall to greed. It severed the last cords that connected the Eastern Roman Empire to the legacy of Rome. From this point forward, Byzantium would be a regional power, proud but diminished, surviving for another 2 centuries, but always retreating, always aging. As the 13th century marched on, the world shifted. The Mongols raged across Asia. The Italian city-states rose. France and England waged their endless wars, and far to the east, the Ottoman Turks began their ascent. Byzantium, wounded and weary, watched the future come, unable to stop it. The sack of Constantinople in 1204 was not the end of the Roman Empire, but it was the moment when the dream of eternal Rome, of one empire, one faith, one civilization, died in fire. What was left behind were memories, ruins, and relics. And yet, in the candles lit beneath cracked icons, in the whispered chants of monks in mountain monasteries, and in the shimmering gold of mosaic halos, Rome still lived, broken but unforgotten.